2,500 years ago. Northern Europe is slowly emerging from the Stone Age. In the Mediterranean, the roots of two great civilizations, Greece and Rome, have yet to take hold. In Mesopotamia, the mighty empire of Assyria is still far in the future. But to the south, on the northeast tip of Africa, something unparalleled in antiquity is taking place. Rising from the banks of the Nile River in Egypt are three colossal pyramids, monuments to the most enduring civilization the world would ever see.
There were many specialized jobs and different paths an Egyptian may take, but 80, perhaps even 90% of Egypt lived similarly to how you'll see today. You may have seen a pyramid like this that breaks down social standing by occupation. These representations are somewhat misguided though. Here's the reality. You are either royal, a free citizen, or a slave. Social class is not like we think of it today. Money didn't exist in ancient Egypt, so there technically wasn't such a thing as a lower, middle, and upper class. You can of course be wealthy through means other than money, but the vast majority of Egyptians were poor farm workers. In ancient Egypt, you were either of royal blood or you were not. So at the very top is our pharaoh and all of his close relatives. Our pharaoh is a god living on earth. His family living in the palace would be incredibly privileged due to their close connection to him. All free citizens are in the next rung down: priests, noblemen, soldiers and scribes, merchants, traders, farmers, and skilled craftsmen. This is everybody that isn't royal but is free according to the law. At the very bottom are serfs and slaves. They had no rights, and many in this group were captured war prisoners. Let's focus on the lives of free men though, specifically farmers, people that owned or worked on farms. Like almost every civilization that came before ours, ancient Egypt was a majority agrarian society. To not farm would be the exception to the rule. So, a whole documentary about farmers. It may not sound like the most glamorous occupation, I know, but this is without a doubt the very best way for us to understand exactly what life was like for most Egyptians. Farmers also did so much more than just farming, so this will be a rich account of daily life. Ancient Egypt and the Nile River. Are we seriously going to talk about a river? Bear with me. The longest river on Earth is unbelievably important to this story. All major cities were built along the Nile. You may have heard the famous quote by Greek historian Herodotus, "Egypt is the gift of the Nile." As a farmer, you couldn't agree with this more. Growing crops was difficult throughout the majority of human history. You had to rely on rainfall. If the clouds didn't shower the earth, your crops didn't grow. If your crops didn't grow, you didn't eat. So we're in the middle of an arid desert. Surely growing crops is virtually impossible. Agriculture in the middle of a desert obviously is not ideal. The good news is the Nile runs through Egypt. It flooded life into what would otherwise be an uninhabitable landscape. The Nile was so consistent that the Egyptians created their entire calendar around it. There were 3 seasons: Akhet, Peret, and Shamu. Every year, the river usually flooded, covering the land in 4 million tons of silt. Silt is a dark, high-quality soil that's excellent for growing crops in. This was the time to sow your seeds. Shamu was when it was time to gather all of the crops you had grown that year. The work life of an Egyptian farmer. The Egyptian idea of work compared to ours is totally alien. You didn't get paid for work like we do. Egyptians didn't have any coins or money, not until Greek and Roman influence anyway. Egyptians also didn't have weekends. The only days you really got off were public holidays. Conveniently, holidays were usually set on days in which you couldn't work anyway because of the season. There is, however, one remarkably unique perk to being an ancient Egyptian farmer. A perk that most workers today would be in total envy of. A benefit that would make work life so much better. The main plus to being an Egyptian farmer is that every day you got to bring your pet cat to work. Just imagine if your office encouraged your cat to accompany you to the workplace. How work would be so much more enjoyable. Whilst Egypt undeniably loved cats, they didn't just let them tag along because they enjoyed the company. We'll get to the whole cat situation in a second. I mentioned that there was no such thing as money, so how exactly did people get paid? Well, workers were most commonly compensated in bread, beer, and sometimes onions. This basically meant that if you wanted something that you couldn't make at home, you needed to barter to acquire it. The wheat and produce that you grew was your currency. Money doesn't grow on trees, they say. Not true if you're an Egyptian farmer. All sorts of vegetables and fruits were grown. The most abundant plants cultivated were two cereal grains, barley and emmer wheat, ingredients used in beer and bread. These were the essentials, and they became the basis of the economy. Towards the end of the Egyptian timeline, new grains were introduced, like rice and other wheat variations, but for the most part, you'd be growing standard wheat and barley crops as a farmer. How farming in ancient Egypt worked. If you didn't have the means to own land for farming, you could rent fertile spots near the Nile which were owned by the government or temples. It was the same routine every year, as the Nile's rising was predictably consistent. Throughout the flood, it wasn't possible to work the land. You need to stay productive though, so during this period you typically repair your tools and construct buildings for the pharaohs such as pyramids or temples. The farming process was a family affair. Together, you'd break down the soil with hoes and plough the fields. The actual mechanics of farming were relatively simple, as no complex mechanical or industrial equipment was used. If you had oxen, they would drag a plough through the ground whilst your son guides them in a straight line. The alternative to ploughing with oxen was manpower. The ground would be ploughed by hand. Once a field was ploughed, your wife or daughter would then scatter the seeds from the baskets they carried. When they'd finished, a herd of sheep would follow, burying the seeds with their hooves. Once this had all been done, it was all about making sure your crops thrive. A lot of your time would be spent in the canals. The canals which carried water to your lands constantly needed repairs. It was essential that they were running optimally because your crops were thirsty and they needed a consistent supply of water. No rain and a massive demand for water meant special tools were needed for irrigation. What you're looking at is one of the most useful inventions around. It's called a shadoof. It's pretty simple, a long pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. It made moving water from the Nile back to your farm much easier, albeit incredibly monotonous. Shadoofs work though. So well, in fact, these tools are still used in some parts of the world to this day. Months pass. Your time will be spent weeding, shooing off birds, and fighting off rats. You now have something extremely important to do, and it must be done right now. Your entire family would race out onto the fields when the crops are ready to be harvested. Your sons would use sickles to cut the wheat heads. Your daughter's wife and grandparents would join in and collect the loose heads from the floor. These would then be tied into bundles. The long wheat stems that remain were collected and used as straw for livestock. The bundles of harvested wheat heads were loaded onto a donkey and transported to the local threshing area. Threshing was the process of separating grain from its husk. Animals like cows, goats, pigs, and donkeys were guided to walk over the grain to separate it. Next, you'd separate the wheat from the chaff by winnowing. Winnowing is the process of tossing wheat into the air so the heavier grain falls to the floor and the chaff blows away. The wheat would be collected and turned into flour when it was needed. You'd ground and sift the wheat to refine it. Your unrefined grain would be stored in a funny-looking silo. These silos were a problem because sometimes rats and mice could get in. Remember how we were talking about bringing your pet cat to work? It makes sense, doesn't it? A pet cat would be invaluable in stopping mice infestations. If you're a cat person and you want to know more about cats in Egypt, I made a short documentary that you will not want to miss. It's called Bastet, the ancient Egyptian cat goddess. You can see the full documentary on my channel for free. Whilst cats were the most popular pet, they weren't the only animals Egyptians brought onto the farm. Outside of domesticated farm animals, a dog would also be a great companion and a beneficial pet. Like cats, dogs are practical. They'd protect your herds of cattle and round them up when needed. There'd be a special place around the side of your house where all of your animals lived. Houses in ancient Egypt. Houses in ancient Egypt ranged from little reed huts to enormous palaces. Many farmers would live modestly in sun-baked mud brick houses. There were lots of clever architectural tricks employed because of the conditions your house would need to protect you from. The desert had wild temperature swings from near 0 to 50 degrees Celsius. Your shelter would need to protect you from both extreme heat and borderline freezing cold. The front door would face north to take advantage of the breeze throughout the day. At the top of your house were small windows that would keep the house cool by allowing the hot air to rise and escape. Reed canopies were often propped up on the roof to create some shade. Adults sat and worked under the canopy whilst children played. These types of houses were built with 3 or 4 main rooms. The entrance was usually a room for people to be received. This room was also dedicated to honoring your local god. The next rooms would be a kitchen or a storeroom. Some houses had an underground cellar that was used to store food. This hidden room was accessed through a hatch on the ground. The final room would be a bedroom. Your family would all sleep in the same room on the floor. In terms of furniture, you'd likely own next to none. Wood was rare and prohibitively expensive. There's not too many forests to cut down in the desert, is there? So that's most of the essential rooms, but one essential room is missing though, isn't it? Where is your bathroom? Both your bathroom and your toilet would be the Nile River itself. The Nile River, or a pot outside of your house that would be emptied into the Nile River. As previously mentioned, outside of your house would be an area where your animals would rest, along with these odd-looking domes, ancient silos full of grain. You'd own several of these silos, as wheat was essential for survival. Every meal featured a grain-derived product, and all meals included bread. Food and drink in ancient Egypt. For us, the daily recommended caloric intake to maintain a healthy weight is around 2,000 calories. This number obviously varies based on body size and exercise levels. Egyptians consume nearly double this every day. 3,780 calories. Interestingly, this is almost exactly the same number of calories the average American eats nowadays. Almost every Egyptian man and woman would be slim, lean, and athletic. So how is it that they'd be in amazing shape by today's standards, yet they ate so many calories? The simple answer is a highly active lifestyle and a diet rich in variety.